The most dangerous phase of an urban evacuation does not begin when authorities issue warnings or when traffic starts to thicken, but in a narrow, often invisible window when movement patterns abruptly diverge from normal statistical behavior and the city's circulation system begins to overload in ways most residents cannot perceive. In those early hours before widespread awareness sets in, small disruptions, an accident at a key interchange, a stalled train, a localized power failure, can interact with human decision-making to produce cascading congestion that rapidly converts mobility into entrapment. The threat is not simply that routes become crowded, it is that the geometry of urban infrastructure concentrates flow into predictable corridors whose capacity limits are exceeded long before most people realize the network is failing. What makes this moment uniquely perilous is that it unfolds quietly, without sirens or visible damage, while the margin for safe exit is already shrinking with each passing minute. From an analytical perspective, cities function as complex adaptive systems, where transportation networks, human behavior, and information flow interact dynamically. Roadways are engineered around peak demand assumptions that tolerate fluctuations, but not simultaneous surges across multiple corridors. When a large proportion of residents attempt to leave within a compressed time frame, the network transitions from fluid to unstable, where minor perturbations, lane changes, braking waves, signal timing mismatches propagate backward as shock waves that multiply congestion. This systemic fragility is compounded by interdependencies with fuel supply chains, traffic control power systems, and digital navigation platforms, meaning that a disruption in one domain amplifies stress in others. Understanding evacuation risk therefore requires shifting focus from individual route selection to network-wide capacity and the nonlinear way congestion spreads. A persistent misunderstanding is the belief that possessing a map or navigation app ensures a viable escape path, as though every road remains equally usable under stress. Everyday experience reinforces the illusion of redundancy because alternate routes appear available in normal conditions, masking the fact that many of these paths converge at shared bottlenecks such as bridges, tunnels, rail crossings, and arterial intersections. Another common assumption is that leaving later might be safer because initial panic will subside, overlooking the reality that once traffic density surpasses a critical threshold, throughput collapses and recovery becomes extremely slow. These misconceptions lead individuals to delay movement or rely on familiar commuting routes, inadvertently placing themselves within the densest flow patterns, precisely when system resilience is lowest. The hidden science governing evacuation efficiency lies in traffic flow theory, human reaction times, and the physics of constrained movement through networks with finite capacity. As vehicle density increases, average speed declines nonlinearly until the system reaches a tipping point, where stop-and-go waves dominate and effective throughput drops sharply despite the same number of lanes. Psychological factors further influence this process, as drivers under stress exhibit shorter following distances, delayed reactions, and erratic decision-making, all of which amplify instability. Urban topology also plays a decisive role. Grid layouts distribute load more evenly than radial designs, while physical choke points impose hard limits regardless of driver intent. These principles reveal that the viability of an evacuation route is determined less by its length and more by its structural position within the network and its exposure to converging flows. Evidence from past evacuations, large-scale drills, and transportation modeling consistently demonstrates that congestion concentrates first at transition zones, where local streets feed into higher-capacity corridors. Data collected during major metropolitan evacuations shows travel times increasing exponentially once road occupancy exceeds roughly one-third of maximum density, with some corridors experiencing near-complete standstill for extended periods. Studies of driver behavior under emergency conditions confirm that a significant portion of evacuees select routes based on familiarity rather than real-time efficiency, reinforcing load imbalances that worsen congestion. These findings underscore that evacuation outcomes are shaped more by collective patterns than individual choices, and that infrastructure limitations, not distance alone, determine whether movement remains possible. The survival implications extend beyond mobility because delayed evacuation exposes individuals to secondary risks such as fuel depletion, heat stress, limited access to medical care, and the psychological strain of prolonged uncertainty. Being immobilized within a vehicle transforms it from a means of escape into a confined environment with constrained resources, while blocked routes impede emergency services attempting to move in the opposite direction. Conversely, those who understand how congestion develops can identify windows of opportunity when lower capacity, but less obvious routes remain viable, preserving the ability to relocate before systemic gridlock takes hold. In this context, situational awareness becomes a protective factor as critical as physical supplies, enabling decisions that align with infrastructure realities rather than assumptions. As conditions intensify, escalation occurs through feedback loops between perception and behavior, where visible congestion prompts more people to depart simultaneously, further saturating the network and accelerating the transition from slow movement to paralysis. Fuel distribution becomes strained as demand spikes, and intersections without power revert to manual control, reducing throughput even further. Environmental variables such as weather or visibility can magnify these effects by lowering safe speeds and increasing accident probability, tightening the operational envelope within which evacuation remains feasible. The system's decline is therefore not a single event, but a progressive contraction of mobility options, each stage narrowing the set of routes that can still function. This trajectory leads into a deeper examination of how certain urban pathways, often overlooked during routine travel, retain functionality longer because they sit outside primary flow convergence zones, revealing that the effectiveness of an evacuation plan depends not on speed alone, but on understanding how infrastructure hierarchy, human behavior, and timing interact to determine which routes remain passable as a city approaches its most critical threshold. As the window for orderly departure narrows, the danger shifts from visible congestion to the less obvious phenomenon of network lock-in, where large portions of the urban population become committed to routes that can no longer sustain movement, yet lack the flexibility to reroute without incurring even greater delays. This stage is hazardous because traffic systems exhibit hysteresis, meaning that once congestion reaches a certain density, restoring flow requires far greater reductions in volume than the increase that caused the breakdown. In practical terms, a corridor that appears merely slow can abruptly transition into a near-permanent standstill, trapping vehicles in positions where turning around or diverting becomes physically impossible. The critical risk here is not simply delay, but the progressive erosion of choice, as the network structure funnels movement into increasingly constrained channels until mobility ceases to be a matter of planning and becomes a matter of circumstance. Analyzing this phase requires examining how urban infrastructure prioritizes efficiency over redundancy under normal conditions, concentrating capacity along a limited number of arterial routes designed to move large volumes quickly. These arterials depend on synchronized signaling, predictable demand patterns, and unobstructed intersections to maintain throughput, conditions that rarely persist during emergencies. Once signal timing is disrupted or intersections become blocked, the mathematical assumptions underlying traffic engineering no longer apply, and the system behaves more like a saturated fluid than a controllable flow. Secondary streets, often dismissed as slower alternatives, can paradoxically retain higher relative mobility because they distribute vehicles across a wider network with fewer high-impact choke points. The analytical insight is that resilience emerges from dispersion rather than speed, a principle frequently overlooked in personal evacuation planning. A widespread misunderstanding is the belief that the fastest route in everyday conditions will remain the most effective during a crisis, reinforcing reliance on major highways and expressways even as they approach failure. Digital navigation tools, while powerful, can exacerbate congestion when large numbers of users receive identical rerouting suggestions, unintentionally synchronizing behavior in ways that overload previously uncongested roads. Another misconception is that traffic congestion will resolve naturally over time, as it often does after routine incidents, ignoring the fact that during mass movement events, demand remains elevated for extended periods, preventing recovery. These assumptions create inertia in decision-making, delaying the transition to alternative strategies until options are severely limited. The hidden science underpinning route viability lies in percolation theory and network resilience modeling, which describe how connectivity degrades as individual links fail or become saturated. In a transportation context, each blocked intersection or stalled vehicle acts as a node failure, reducing the number of continuous paths through the network. Once failures exceed a critical threshold, the network fragments into isolated clusters, within which movement may still occur locally but cannot extend outward. This explains why some neighborhoods remain navigable internally, while access to external corridors becomes impossible. The phenomenon highlights the importance of maintaining route diversity and avoiding dependence on any single corridor, as the probability of network fragmentation increases rapidly once congestion intensifies. Empirical evidence from transportation simulations and real evacuation case studies demonstrates that distributed departure patterns consistently outperform synchronized mass movement, reducing total clearance time and lowering the likelihood of systemic gridlock. Observations from metropolitan evacuations show that individuals who utilized a combination of minor roads, service lanes, and non-traditional connectors were able to maintain steady progress even when primary routes were immobilized. Traffic sensor data further reveals that congestion spreads outward from major bottlenecks in branching patterns, indicating that distance from a choke point often correlates more strongly with mobility than nominal road capacity. These findings reinforce the principle that understanding network topology provides a tangible advantage in preserving movement options. The survival implications extend into resource management as prolonged immobilization increases fuel consumption, accelerates dehydration risks, and limits access to sanitation and medical support. Vehicles caught in static queues become energy sinks, consuming limited reserves without advancing towards safety, while individuals on less congested routes retain the flexibility to adjust plans as conditions evolve. Maintaining mobility, therefore, functions as both a logistical and physiological safeguard, preserving not only the ability to relocate, but also the resources necessary to sustain that movement. In this sense, route selection influences survival outcomes indirectly by shaping exposure duration to stressors inherent in extended travel disruptions. Escalation emerges as infrastructure strain compounds over time, with minor incidents such as vehicle breakdowns or minor collisions exerting disproportionate impact in already saturated conditions, further fragmenting the network. Public transit interruptions, signal outages, and fuel shortages interact to reduce overall transportation capacity, while communication delays hinder the dissemination of accurate route information. The cumulative effect is a progressive narrowing of viable pathways, where each new disruption amplifies the consequences of previous ones, accelerating the transition from constrained mobility to widespread immobilization. The system's decline becomes self-reinforcing, driven by feedback loops between physical congestion and human response. This progression leads into a closer exploration of how timing, behavioral flexibility, and situational awareness intersect to determine whether movement remains possible, revealing that the routes most likely to remain functional are not those designed for maximum throughput, but those embedded within the broader network in ways that minimize dependence on synchronized control systems and high-density convergence points. Timing becomes the decisive variable once awareness of impending disruption intersects with the physical realities of urban movement, because departure decisions made even an hour apart can place individuals on entirely different sides of the network's stability threshold. The danger in this phase is subtle yet consequential. Leaving too late exposes travelers to the exponential growth of congestion, while leaving prematurely without sufficient information can redirect them into emerging hazard zones or unnecessary exposure. This temporal sensitivity exists because transportation systems operate near capacity under normal conditions, meaning only a modest surge in demand is required to push them beyond equilibrium. When departure waves synchronize, intersections saturate, queue lengths propagate backward through corridors, and the effective reach of congestion expands non-linearly. The result is a landscape where time itself reshapes geography, turning short distances into prolonged ordeals and compressing decision windows to moments rather than hours. From an analytical perspective, this dynamic reflects queuing theory and demand elasticity, where small fluctuations in arrival rates produce disproportionate increases in wait times once service capacity is exceeded. Urban evacuation models consistently show that early staggered departures reduce peak load and preserve network function, while delayed mass movement overwhelms even high-capacity infrastructure. The interaction between human perception and system performance is central here, as individuals tend to wait for confirmation of risk before acting, inadvertently synchronizing their behavior with thousands of others making the same calculation. This collective hesitation converts a manageable flow into a surge, demonstrating that the physics of congestion are inseparable from the psychology of decision-making. A persistent misunderstanding is the belief that waiting for clearer information always improves outcomes, when in reality, delayed clarity often arrives after mobility options have already degraded. Many assume that official instructions will precede critical thresholds, Yet emergency messaging frequently lags behind real-time conditions due to verification requirements and communication bottlenecks. Another common error is equating distance from a perceived hazard with safety, overlooking that the true constraint is not proximity, but the integrity of the pathways required to move. These misconceptions encourage passivity at precisely the moment when proactive positioning would preserve flexibility, reinforcing the pattern of synchronized departure that destabilizes the network. The hidden science explaining why early movement confers such an advantage lies in phase transitions within complex systems, where gradual changes accumulate until a tipping point triggers abrupt reconfiguration. Traffic networks, like other distributed systems, exhibit critical thresholds beyond which recovery becomes difficult without substantial external intervention. Prior to this point, alternative routes remain viable and travel times increase only modestly. Afterward, even minor disruptions propagate widely, and travel times escalate dramatically. Recognizing these thresholds requires understanding indicators such as rising intersection delays, irregular signal patterns, and localized bottlenecks, all of which signal that the system is approaching instability. By interpreting these cues, individuals can act before the network crosses into a regime where movement becomes largely reactive rather than strategic. Evidence from evacuation timing studies repeatedly demonstrates that households departing during early advisory phases experience significantly shorter travel durations and encounter fewer secondary hazards than those leaving after mandatory orders. Traffic flow reconstructions following major storms reveal that once roadway occupancy surpasses a critical density, average speeds collapse and remain depressed long after demand begins to decline, confirming the persistence of congestion effects. Behavioral research also shows that individuals who monitor multiple information sources and adjust plans dynamically are less likely to become trapped in deteriorating conditions. These findings illustrate that timing advantages arise not from luck, but from interpreting system signals and acting before collective behavior converges. The survival implications extend beyond mere travel efficiency, influencing exposure to environmental stressors, access to fuel and supplies, and the psychological burden associated with prolonged uncertainty. Shorter transit times reduce the likelihood of encountering cascading disruptions, such as fuel shortages or roadway closures, while maintaining schedule flexibility allows for course corrections as new information emerges. Conversely, late departures often force travelers into reactive decisions under fatigue, increasing the risk of navigation errors, resource depletion, and unsafe stopping conditions. The difference in outcomes underscores how temporal positioning can shape not only mobility, but overall resilience during prolonged disruptions. Escalation becomes evident as the event timeline lengthens, with infrastructure wear, enforcement measures, and resource constraints progressively altering the operational landscape. Roadway incidents accumulate, enforcement checkpoints modify traffic patterns, and localized shortages influence route viability, creating a moving target that requires continuous reassessment. The longer the disruption persists, the more the system diverges from its original configuration, making early assumptions about route conditions increasingly unreliable. Mobility thus transitions from a one-time decision to an adaptive process, where situational awareness must be maintained throughout the journey to avoid converging with newly formed bottlenecks. This evolving temporal dimension leads naturally into a deeper examination of how micro-level navigation choices, environmental observation, and decentralized decision-making interact to preserve movement, even as macro-level